So I'm sitting here in my living room with Matt Lemay. Matt is a really good friend that I'm I'm not even sure where we met, Matt. Maybe your first Unitarian. And I know we've had things where we intersected at First Unitarian and a lot of other places. And Matt is one of the smartest, most caring people I know, and he's got really good perspective on things. And I'm really glad to be sitting here with him. So Matt, can you introduce yourself? Tell people who you are.
Um, well, none of what you said is true, except First Unitarian part. Um, so my family comes from Missouri, and we come from Kansas City. I was born in a small town in northern Missouri called Marceline, and we moved here when I was 8 years old. I think, like everybody else in Colorado, we moved from somewhere else. And we moved to a house in Aurora, and I spent a lot of my adult life trying to escape Denver and Aurora. And I swore that that I would never own a house, it would never be in the suburbs, and then it would never be in Aurora, and now I own that house in Aurora, Colorado, in the suburbs. So yeah, that's neat.
Yeah. And when Matt says he lives in the suburbs, he lives not too far off of Colfax and like Peoria, which is hardly the suburbs.
Yeah.
So Matt, I know you did a lot of work. Several years ago, you were really involved with the Harm Reduction Center, which is a needle exchange here in Denver. Can you tell us about working with them and why you worked with them, who they are?
Who they are. So it took me a long time to quit drinking. So I'm a alcoholic, and I guess people say about themselves that we're in recovery, and I guess, I mean, there's an element of truth to that for me. I spent a good 15 years of my life, like, really as a very serious, hard drinker and alcoholic, with a lot of bad memories from that. And so I was able to get sober. I think there are many of us who have really serious substance abuse problems, and sort of as we go about life, by the time we hit around 30 or so, but I suppose those of us who are lucky enough we sort of get tired of it, and so I think that's what happened to me. But I just got tired of it. I mean, there's the book that we read related to the Harm Reduction Action Center, about the syringe exchange in Canada, and Dr. Gabor Mate, the way he described the people who visit that place. Or, there's this idea that you hit rock bottom, and then once you hit rock bottom, then you look at your life and you realize what you're doing is wrong. But for me, what resonated about that book was his description of people who just hit rock bottom time after time after time, and keep getting lower and lower. And that's the way it was for me. And so when I quit drinking, there was never a rock bottom moment for me, and I've got a collection of rock bottom moments. Well, so anyway, I quit drinking and made it 8 or 9 years, and wound up moving back to Kansas City for a job. And I gave in to this voice that said, well, wouldn't it be nice if I could go to the bar and have a beer or two? And that was really nice, except that a beer or two was never enough for me, and would never be enough for me. And so as I was continuing to drink for about a year in Kansas City, I read an article about an illegal syringe exchange here in Denver, and so I think it was an article in Westward. And so when I came back, I asked Randall if he knew anybody involved in the syringe exchange because I wanted to go do some volunteering with them, and he sort of misdirected me to the Harm Reduction Action Center, and that's how I found out about them. And when I first went there, they were really a day shelter for IV drug users, and I really learned a lot about people suffering with IV drug habits, and it's just an incredible place for people who could come while they were high. They could not get high there. But they could just hang out there and sort of drool and stare at the ceiling if that's where they were at, and they could be safe there, and they could wash their clothes and take a shower. If you were lucky there, they had a lottery because there just wasn't a place like that in Denver. And so they prepared a meal, a lunch, and that's a lot of my volunteering was that. And I learned an awful lot about the concept of harm reduction and just the idea that hey, we've been locking people up for 20 years if they're drug users, and that just makes everything worse. It makes people's problems, compounds their problems. People go to jail and come out HIV positive and then infect other people, and because they can't get access to clean syringes, then people wind up sharing needles and spread hepatitis and HIV. And so the idea of, well, let's quit hurting people to try to make them better and let's try loving them instead, I think is just a really beautiful idea, and that's a beautiful place. And one thing that has always impressed me about you is that when you're working with somebody who needs your help, if I'm there and I hear you, then it makes everybody feel better. And so Harm Reduction Action Center has many people like you who do that with the people they serve, and so I just think it's a beautiful place.
Yeah, man, and they do a lot to fight stigma too, which is such a big thing. Not beating people up for being down and building people up is such a big thing, and not villainizing people. Um, and your mom had some opiate problems or issues, right? And
She
can you
did.
tell us a little bit about that?
So my mom, I think for many middle class people, it's the way they experience the opioid epidemic, what we consider opioid epidemic. That she had severe arthritis in her hip that was making her. It was just really difficult for her to walk. So she went in for a hip replacement surgery, and one of our hospitals here is renowned across the country for doing joint replacement surgeries. And I want to say it's Porter. It's Porter, right? Is the joint replacement. And so anyway, she went in to have that done. And while she was in the hospital, she got an infection by a flesh-eating bacteria, a really serious one that only lives in hospitals. And I don't have the name of the strain, but it's not MRSA, but it's sort of in that same space of flesh-eating bacteria. And she had to be, so the pain, like after the hip replacement, had never went away. And so the way she found out that she was infected with that was she was readmitted to the hospital with the pain that she was having, and she had a swelling that wouldn't go away. And to hear my dad tell it, I was out of town one of the times trying to escape Colorado and Denver. She was in the hospital, and to hear my dad say it, she would have died if not for the intervention of a PA who suggested. So he took tests and blood tests, and they didn't see anything in the blood tests, but this PA suggested, well, we'll draw blood from the swelling, the edema, and that's how they found this flesh-eating bacteria, and began her journey, really, where they had to wind up opening her back up and cleaning out all the necrotic tissue, and because of that, she lost a lot of muscle mass, and so she wound up being in pain that was worse from the cure than what she was experiencing to begin with. And so she had a GP and who started prescribing her opioids. So she started on Percocets and then graduated to Oxy and then wound up on fentanyl patches. And this was all through a GP who didn't know what he was doing. And he retired sort of subsequently. But my mom, like because of my work with HVAC, and I knew about options like Suboxone, and there's I think some really fantastic outpatient programs here for people of means who my mom would have fit into that category, and she couldn't do that. She didn't. Suboxone wasn't right for her because she was older, and it's a difficult thing to get right, or at the time anyway. The way I understood it was that they have to get the dosage exactly right, and it's sort of a shock. It's like jumping in ice water or something, where there's an immediate shock, and then like you're off of everything right away. And she couldn't face either one of those options, and she wound up determining to and so she went to pain management specialists, and what they told her is that she was, with the fentanyl patches she was taking the equivalent of 60 Percocet a day.
Wow.
And she determined to get off the fentanyl, and she reduced her dosage in half, and then in half again, and in half again, and that was too much for her, so she went back up, not all the way back up, but it was from 12% to 25%. And that's when she died. And it's, to me, really took my mom away from me, because on that dosage she'd sleep a lot, and so she slept anywhere 14 to 17 hours a day, and so she couldn't do a lot of the things that my parents enjoyed doing. So they couldn't go to the symphony, they couldn't go out for dinner at night because she'd have to go to sleep. And towards the end, I would go see them on Sundays due to full sun, and she would make dinner and eat dinner with us, and then go on up to bed. And the last time that I went there while she was alive, she had made dinner for my dad and I, and then she went up to bed before I got there. And so it's something I haven't had a lot of time to grieve for my mom, and it's something that I always think about, that she made this great dinner and wound up going on up to bed, and I missed seeing her that day. It's the last time I could have seen her. And the next day I got a call from my dad at 10 in the morning. I'll never forget his words. Matt, something horrible has happened. Your mother has died.
Wow.
So that was her odyssey with opioids.
Thanks for sharing that, Matt. I want to back up a little bit and tell us a little bit more about where you're living now. What's your living situation?
Well, so after Mom died, I was living with a girlfriend at the time, and I was really worried about my dad, as my dad's 5 years older, and they'd been together. It wound up being 48 and a half years, and they had a change jar where they would put their change, and my dad, well, they were both big fans of Car Talk, and so my dad had borrowed the Save This Geet Foundation idea, and so I put this poster on this change jar, and they were saving up for a vacation for their 50th anniversary. And so I was just really worried about my dad, because when people are together that long and one of them dies, it's really common for the other partner to die soon after that. And so I spent a lot of time with going over a couple times a week to have dinner and hang out with dad, and wound up breaking up with the girl over several years, I guess, and with the woman, excuse me. I get myself in trouble with language because if I say girl, then it's offensive, and if I say woman, it can be more offensive because I don't recognize her youth and beauty. Anyway, so I wound up buying the house, and the elderly father came with it.
So you're living with your dad,
Yeah.
and in the house that you basically grew up in.
Yeah.
Except for you own it now.
Yeah. I own it, all the problems. So somehow when I was a teenager, I had to do all the yard work, and I didn't own the house then, but now that I own the house, I still have to do all the yard work.
You need to get a teenager, man.
I'm in the market for one. They're hard to buy.
So moving on here, I know you worked at the Catholic Worker for many years. You volunteered there for many years, and that's a place we both have ties. Do you want to talk about your time with the Catholic Worker?
Yes. So after I quit drinking, I lived in Boston, and it's a hard goddamn city to live in, and it's a hard city to move to without knowing anybody there. And for my career, I worked outside Boston, and so I didn't have a car, and just for various reasons, I never fell into a community with the people I work with, and then I could never. I think I was incompetent at finding people, so it was really pretty isolating for me in Boston. I just didn't have many friends there, and so I quit drinking, but there was just something missing. So I think about my drinking. For me, the role that it played for me. There's a great short story by Tolstoy, and I will forget the name of it, but it's describing the landed baron or whatever in the country, and he has these peasants who work for him, and so one of the characters is a person who has my pattern of drinking. So every 6 months he would just take all of his salary and drink until he ran out of money. And that's sort of my pattern of drinking, where every 6 months, I would be functional and hold down the job and everything would be great. I'd even go out with coworkers or friends to bars on the weekends, but then once every 6 months I would drink for 5 straight days until the shakes got too bad to leave my apartment. And after that, I would just feel so devastated, the biggest piece of shit in the world. And then a part of the recovery, we'd go through DTs occasionally, and if nothing else, I'd just sit there just shaking. And there's this shaking that you only get from a 5-day drunk where you're drying out, and a part of that, and just sweating. I would just sweat and sweat. It could be cold, and I'd be sweating and shaking. But anyway, through that, I would realize that I wasn't that big piece of shit that I thought I was, and then I'd feel better about myself. And so when I quit drinking, that part was just gone. I didn't have that way of getting to feel better about myself, so I just sort of felt worse and worse about myself. And so that's how I wound up at the Unitarian Church, is just in this real kind of pit of despair, and there I ran into you and a lot of amazing people, that also Randall again, who I'd mentioned, and that I was sitting talking to him one night in the office of the Unitarian Church, and in my memory, I'm sitting on the floor, and Randall's sitting at the computer, and the glow of the computer is on. And I tried doing some volunteer stuff at a couple places, and it just like they had me picking stuff up and moving stuff, you know. Like, I volunteered at the Coalition one time, and it was around Christmas. So there's that Toys for Tots drive, and so my job was taking these toys that have been donated. And for me, it was just so offensive because they had these little Bratz dolls, which are I think, probably to me, one of the most offensive gifts that you could give to a little girl to make her feel insecure and like she needed to go out and buy and shop. And so that's what I was doing, is I was packaging that shit up to here this program, you know, that's can be really good, I think, and it can be really bad too. And my part of that was just packaging crap up. It was really unhappy. So I didn't enjoy doing that at all. And I mentioned that to Randall, and he told me about the Catholic Worker House, and so I called to volunteer there, and I got the answering machine, and I left a message, and I didn't hear anything back, and I think I did that 2 or 3 times, and finally something prompted me just to go over there, and so they invited me to dinner, and asked me what I'd be interested in doing, and so I wound up just being on the house on Sundays, so the live-in workers could get out of the house and didn't have to answer the phone. And I got to cook dinner there too, and I really enjoyed that a lot.
You just kind of were with the people that were living there, right? You just
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're, to me, like a part of the joy of service work is you really, like, it strips away all of the bullshit of our world. Like, you know, you're not judged by the clothes that you're wearing, or whether you have a car, or the kind of car that you're driving, or you know, whether you listen to this or that music, you know, because it's like people's needs I mean, people just have their basic needs, and so you can connect on a level that you just don't get on in any other scenario, you know, like eating and like just existing, and so it's just a different experience, and especially working in the corporate world is just so there's so much judgment about the kind of car that you drive and the clothes that you're wearing and where'd you go to school and like what fraternity did you belong to, and like all of this bullshit. None of it has anything to do with the work that you do, but yet it controls, I think in a very real way, it controls your destiny in the corporate world. Yeah, it's a clothes make the man thing, which is, I mean, maybe you could, well, clothes make the man, it's a truism. And at the Catholic Worker House or HRAC or WHI, you don't have that.
Yeah. But just for the people listening, you're not Catholic, right?
Well, as it happens, the first time I had communion was at the Catholic Worker House.
Yeah.
It was flour tortillas that had been salvaged from a dumpster outside the tortilla factory down there in 10th and Osage or wherever that is, and wine in a Dixie cup. And I will admit to having a sip of the communal wine from a Dixie cup, but otherwise I'm not Catholic. No.
yeah, it's my experience too. I'm not Catholic, but I love the Catholic worker anyway.
Yeah.
Then you were talking about the WHI, which is a women's homeless initiative, which is just briefly, it's a program where women that are houseless go to a different church every night of the week. So every night they're in a different church. And it's a real mixed bag. In some places they get treated really well, and some places they get treated like criminals or children, depending, or criminal children maybe. Um, so it's really a mixed um, bag. But you volunteered with um, WHI for a long time, right?
Yeah, I think so. Uh, so WHI stopped. Probably it was February or March of 2020
Because of the pandemic.
because of the pandemic, and I mean I think I was there from about a month after it started, and I started volunteering at St. Barnabas, an Episcopal church. And before you ask, I'm not an Episcopal either. Um, Although I spent a lot of time at St. Barnabas with WHI, and then several of their church activities, and then we started at First Unitarian. I think about we were 2 or 3 years into the program, and the program ran 9 years or something. So
Can you talk about your relationship to some of the participants?
well, I mean, you really put your finger on the pulse of WHI and saying, it's sort of a very mixed bag because we when the program started, so it's a program, as you well know, is something that, like, there are analogs in Boulder that I think are much more successful, where people have a little more stability and they're able to house a lot more people than the WHI did. And also you were part of a program that happened when I went back to Kansas City, where we were providing the emergency overflow shelter, which was its own very mixed bag. And so there's that aspect of it, and then there's the aspect where like, so every night it takes place at a different church, and so 20 to 25 women would be loaded onto a shuttle, and the shuttle might have to make a couple trips from St. Francis to bring the women. And prior to that, you need this battalion of volunteers to come in and do all this work of setting up cots and making dinner and making breakfast bags. And so you said to me at one point that probably if we had taken all the volunteer hours that went into that and put it into building houses, we probably could have built houses for everybody in Denver experiencing homelessness. And I think to me, I mean, that's the real deep irony. But that said, I mean, the WHI, so WHI, and I think Deanna is the first to say, it's not meant to be a solution to the problem. And I think, and maybe this is me interpreting what she was saying, but I think it was as much political as a way to point out to the then administration of Denver that, hey, we have this really big fucking problem, and this is something that we're doing that the people of Denver are doing, so why can't you do better? And so, I mean, there is a real need, because, as you know better than I could ever explain, we don't know how many people are experiencing homelessness. We know there are a hell of a lot of them. There are a hell of a lot more than they count in the census every year. And moreover, one of the real gaps that we had at the time WHI started was an understanding of how many of those people, really chronically homeless people, are women. And so women are particularly vulnerable on the street for many reasons. Like, there are far too many stories of women who accept the seeming help from a Samaritan that just turns into a nightmare for them. They can wind up dying from it, or they can wind up addicted to drugs of various kinds, because people are, there are a lot of predators out there preying on. They're just very vulnerable, and so
a lot of rape and kidnap.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a real need. So, to me, that's the really beautiful part of the WHI. And, I mean, it's an experience that I mean, it means so much to me. And there's something, so at the Catholic Worker, people would be, a lot of people in the house would, if the weather was nice, they'd get out and go to the park or just get out. And so you may or may not see people. There were days when there was nobody else there. It was just me answering the phone until dinner time, which is great. There were other days there were a lot of people around. And HVAC was interesting because there were people I got to know there really well. But sometimes people would like take off and go to the Springs. I wouldn't see them for 6 months or something, and so WHI. So there were probably at any given time 70 women or so who would stay with WHI, and this was another mixed bag part of the problem. I mentioned there was 20 to 25 a night, and probably 70 who were actively using WHI. So every day there'd be a lottery. But over time, you really tended to see a lot of the same people, and so you really got to develop these relationships with people, and it was just beautiful. It really was.
Yeah, it was. I remember an image that I always loved. A sight that I always loved was when the women came to the church. You were supposed to read this huge list of rules that were like, spelt out. Hey, you're a child, and we're here to take care of you, and this is what you have to do, or you get sent to bed without dinner. And you were supposed to read this rule and these rules to the women, and you just post it on a board and say, "Hey, read this when you get time. You're an adult. Just take care of yourself and take care of each other." Yeah.
We read the rules one time, and it was the first night that we hosted, and it was because Deanna was there. I'm not sure I ever saw that list of rules ever again.
Well, you always posted them on the board, as far as I remember, but you never.
I don't think so. I don't think we even posted it on the board.
It doesn't matter anyway.
But I mean,
but it was beautiful.
Like there were some churches where they had, it was like Charlton Heston with the 10 Commandments, and they were read, and the rules, like you said, they were like, thou shalt not pee on the floor, and thou shalt not shoot people with guns, and like, my God.
Yeah, it was pretty silly stuff. I mean, pretty much you just had to say, don't hurt yourself, don't hurt anybody, be cool. I mean, you don't. Anyway, I digress. So, Matt, tell me about work and what work has meant for you, and what are your thoughts on work?
So I mean, this really cuts to the heart of who I am, and that when I turned 18, or it was a little before I turned 18, was when something really started going wrong with me mentally, and I got to be really paranoid in ways. So at the time, so my family picked up and moved to Virginia, and I was a teenager, and so I'd always had, like, I never quite fit in as a kid, and so I wound up listening to heavy metal and falling in with that crowd. And so in my senior year, I was taking acid more or less every week and smoking a lot of pot, and I was, for a long time, I blamed my mental health issues on taking acid, and for a long time I really was into Timothy Leary, of all things, which is a crazy thing to do, because Timothy Leary, I think by the time I came along, he had lost his cultural currency, I think, and people there were those who venerated him, like those who loved Jim Morrison poetry of that category, but otherwise, I mean, it was kind of non-existent for, I think, people my age in particular. But anyway, that's how I really got into drinking, was to solve that problem of my paranoia about people. I felt like I was continually being judged and persecuted by people I didn't know, and situations, like social situations, and drinking fixed that. So when I think about work, like it's difficult for me to sort out like reality from my delusions, and so for me, so I'm a computer programmer, and that's I fell into that because I didn't. When you're 18 and it's like, okay, go off to college and figure out what you want to do with the rest of your life, or if you are like me, the product of good American middle class stock. And I mean, otherwise, it's the expectation. Maybe you go join the military and figure out what you want to do with the rest of your life, or go, go find some career and get everything sorted from the time you're 18 to now and almost 51. And really, it's just a complete disaster. I mean, I didn't know anything else to do. I mean, I can't say it's a complete disaster. I've done very well in my career. But I feel like in this country we really disparage computer work, and we look down on the people who do it. And in a lot of ways, we look down on computers in a way that feels to me very much like middle school. So in middle school, I was not one of the popular kids in middle school, and so I hung out at the computer lab after school, and so I was the quintessential nerd. And I think that label is something that has really stuck with me all of my life. And there's an awful lot of reality to that, and I don't know how much of it is my sort of innate paranoia of feelings of persecution, but there's a lot of truth to it. And so I've worked in the corporate world I think I started when I was 25 or 26. Because we moved around a lot, it took me a while to finish up college, and I never did wind up finishing it. So I was 25 or 26 when I got my first job, which means I've been at this for 25 or 26 years. And so most of that time has been spent in more or less Fortune 500 kind of corporate America, and some of the time was at the quintessential startup companies in 99 and 2000, or 2000, 2001 especially. So the quintessential startup I was working at in 2001 closed on September 11th, 2001, which was kind of a momentous thing where you're watching the coverage in the morning of the World Trade Center towers going down, and the Pentagon bombing, and the Pennsylvania one, and then so I listened to it on the radio, I turned on the TV, I watched the coverage, I went into work, and they said, board pulled the funding, get your stuff and get out of here. And that was a big irony, really, that it happened that day. But I mean, it's an interesting experience because the corporate world is just like, it is so bad, and it's an unreality unto its own. I mean, it really is. And so some things about it have been really good. Like I've really gotten to meet many people from Asia, in particular South Asia and India. And I've gotten to know the food and the culture quite a bit, and it's inspired me, along with some pointers from people like you, to people like Aaron Dottie Roy, and I think some really good stuff there. I mean, I love the Indian people I've worked with. Generally speaking, are quick to laugh, and are people who have a really good sense of humor, and people who can be very talented at the work that we do. But I would say, and this is, over the last 5 years especially, this has come into focus, where it's kind of a familiar pattern for this country, where we We import people from the other side of the world to do work that we don't like to do ourselves in the form of IT, and
Or picking vegetables.
or picking vegetables, um, and so or working in our meat processing plants, or and so, like, given that, I mean, if you look at it through that lens, then there's a lot of really disturbing parallels with the past. So now people make a nominal wage, and there are people on H-1Bs who do quite well for themselves, but then there are an awful lot of people, are just barely making over minimum wage doing it. And it's doing this work, like we were complaining, I mean, you can't have two people get together without complaining about websites and applications on the phone, and like it's all very part and parcel of that experience of, like, to me, I mean, what it feels like is we have these sort of frat boy heroes who are these MBA type people who everybody loves, and they're very social and outgoing, and then they oversee this vast set of people here on H-1Bs, and within that system, some people rise up and they have higher sort of benefits bestowed upon them, and they just treat everybody else like shit. It's just really disturbing to me, the parallels in this world with the way things have always worked, I guess. But it's this sort of unreality where it's like the Obama problem. It's like, oh, well, now we have a black president, and like all the problems with racism are solved. Like, this is another lens where it shines the light on that and shows it to be the bullshit that it is. And just for the record, I've never, and Arnie, you can attest to this better than anybody else, have you ever known me any day to say, well, I love my job, or really happy with it?
I think if I had a dime for every time you said I hate my job, I could retire. I am retired.
You are retired. Maybe you got that dime.
Yeah. But yeah, I know that you really don't like the work you do. And you feel it's real dehumanizing and degrading.
Very much. And it's sort of an incredible world. So I've worked as a web developer for 20 years, and I think like many people in IT, especially people like me, so I was a computer science major in college, but I didn't have anything else. So like if I would have known more when I was going into it, I could have studied biology, and I really enjoy that. And used a computer science background that way, or found like anything else to go along with it. But since I didn't specialize in any way, I became a web developer. And the thing that is so frustrating to me about it is I went back to college 4 or 5 years ago. I was going to finish a degree in math, and I'm really not smart enough for math. I just don't have the aptitude for it, is the way I should say it. Because I think it is something that either you have an aptitude for it or you don't, and I just don't have the aptitude for it. But the thing that really impressed me, like one thing I really liked about college the first time around is, and what I liked about computers growing up is, like, you can use computers to compute. I mean, what a revolutionary idea that is, because working in this industry, if you would have asked me before I went back to college, well, what do you use computers for? I would have told you, well, you harvest email addresses, do everything by hook and crook that you can to find out as much personal information about people, and then use that to target advertising at them. That's what computers are for, because that's what my career was. And it's sort of stunning, like there's just so much money in the field that probably 50 to 60% of the people I work with are completely non-technical. So they don't know how computers work, or they don't know how software works. And their job is to manage the people like me who do. And so that's when I alluded earlier, these hero frat boy MBAs, and they'll inevitably have this swarm of pretty young 20-something women swarming around them. There's the UI expert, the marketing people, and the salespeople, and the whole other world of people who can either be good or bad, but product owners and product managers and scrum masters and business analysts. And so all of those people are non-technical, and they all drive and control the work that I do, and it's a very frustrating dynamic.
Yeah.
And I feel like that more than anything else is why nothing ever works.
So, Matt, I know you've been studying French for the last couple of years, and you have plans on moving to France, right?
I do.
Yeah, and why are you doing that? Why would you want to move from beautiful Aurora, Colorado to France?
So I always have preferred British spellings of words with the extra U in there. So I think color should be spelled Colour. And so when I discovered French, there's not only U, but there's EAX. Practically in the French language, there's one letter that you pronounce and all the rest of them are silent. It's brilliant. So how could I not love that language, given that? Well, a little more seriously, I think this is like, as I reflect on it, it's kind of a Western intellectual thing, right? And so I've always had, I guess I would be a pseudo-intellectual in a Woody Allen movie. But it really follows a very rich tradition in the US and UK anyway, of people who wind up in and around France. We have so many literary figures, from James Baldwin comes to mind from recent reading, and Mark Twain and Edith Wharton, and the French love for jazz music is like after jazz sort of fell out of vogue here, and a lot of the people could go to France. So Louis Armstrong is a great example where he famously wouldn't play places here that were not integrated, and they just didn't experience that in the same way in France. And I think jazz lived on in a way in France that it just didn't here. And so moreover, like the French culture is very big, like everything else, and there's an awful lot of bad in the history that we've talked about, but there's also an awful lot of good too. And I absolutely love Victor Hugo and others, and there's a French tradition of questioning and critiquing that is very very much in my heart, and so I would just love to be someplace in Europe, because I guess I'm a very Western European sort of, like, it's all my bias, and it's not like, I'm not saying that I think that the Western European tradition is better. It's just that I've been steeped in it, and I don't want that culture to go dominate the rest of the world, but it's what I've been steeped in, and I would love to be able to go to Greece and Germany and all over Europe, and it'd be closer to go to India and Nepal too, for that matter, which is very much on my list. So,
is there any reason why you want to leave America, the United States?
Well, many reasons. Like the great regret of my life, and this is something that I really struggle a lot with, is I really wanted, or I expected to be married, and I really wanted to have kids, and so that has not come to fruition. And on top of that, the U.S. politically, it's just, so I guess I'm untethered in a way that allows me to do that. And moreover, the U.S. politics are just so hopelessly fucking broken, and it's and it just seems unfixably broken in ways. It'll be generations upon generations if we don't fall into a very serious and very scary form of, white Christian nationalist fascism, which we seem to be teetering on the brink of. I mean, I think, and I mentioned this earlier, and I mentioned before, but like Trump is the sort of, to me, coming from corporate America, is the platonic ideal of an American, and he just makes an awful lot of sense to me through that lens, because he's utterly incompetent, blowhard, a racist asshole, um, and he's a real showman. And I've heard this analysis before, but for a lot of like Americans who are poor and struggling, Trump is somebody who, by his own story, if not the facts, he's a self-made man with this $1 million loan from his dad, and he's got beautiful wives and fancy mansions and Trump Tower. And again, I mean, granted, all of that's a facade and a lie, but that too is quintessentially American. Is reality doesn't matter. Reality is what you make of it. It doesn't matter that every single fucking one of his businesses has failed, and like there's so many awful, awful stories in his past. The deal with the European bank, where he took out a big loan to buy a building in Chicago, and the building practically went bankrupt on him, and so they were after him to pay off his loan for that Trump building. And so he finagled a loan from the same bank to pay off the interest on the other loan. And it's such a house of cards, and it just feels like the platonic idea of what America is, because I recognize Trump and most of the bosses that I've had in corporate America.
Wow.
And so in spite of like all the things that I've done, like I would have loved to say, well, in doing this volunteer work, I really met this really amazing and supporting community of people. I mean, that never materialized. I mean, I know there are a handful of people I know like you, and I've mentioned Randall and, Anna Coop from the Catholic Worker, and I mean, there's too many people to list, but it's like, I mean, another thing is people tend to be older than me, as people who I relate to in particular, and you're a youngster among that crowd, and we're not the same age. I mean, and I just do not relate to anybody within 15 years of me, because so many of them, like we talk about, you have to have a positive attitude all the time, and you have to frame everything in the form of an affirmative, and that's just, and we have to accept like advertising as a part of our life, because that's how they pay the bills. And it's not appropriate to be critical of sexualizing 12-year-old girls. So we have to consume Disney. Like everything Disney does, we just have to gobble it up, and we can't question that. And I mean, it just sort of goes on and on, where I just, I've never fell in with a community of people my own age who I really connect with.
But Matt, you keep getting up every day and doing what you got to do, and you've done some great work in your life.
Thank you.
Excuse me. What keeps you going? What gets you up every day, and you take care of your father, and you're learning French. You just keep going. What keeps you going?
Right now it's probably moving to France is still very much a fantasy for me. And I say that mainly because of my dad. That I would never leave my dad here. I feel like he wouldn't make it very long on his own, and he would never consent to go into a assisted living sort of thing, and I would never want to see that. And he doesn't want to move to Europe. And I think, like many people of his generation, he still thinks about the French in World War II as sort of cowards or something. But nonetheless, I mean, I do spend an awful lot of time reading and trying to listen to French, and so I am living on that sort of fantasy right now. And I think, I mean, it's sort of grim, the implication of that if you think about it. But I'm really not sitting around waiting for Dad to die. I'm sitting around waiting for a resolution, and it could be that he comes with me, or it could be that you never know what the future holds, I guess. Like one thing that is really missing for me right now is the volunteer work, because I just don't have that way of connecting with people that I described. And as we've talked about earlier, like when you live where we do, in these vast suburban wastelands, it can be very isolating, and it's hard to find like-minded people. It's hard to find people who are not living at HGTV or HGTV fantasy. So I guess the fantasy that keeps me going is the moving to France fantasy. It could have been the HGTV fantasy, but thank God it's not.
It's not buying into that stuff. Well, Matt, let's leave it there, man. I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you and I love you, and I'm glad that you're part of my life.
Well, and very much a person I've sure learned a lot from over the years, and it just really means a lot to me that you would think of me and include me in this project.
Of course I would, man. Love you, brother. That was good, Matt.